get so bored I could scream. I'd like to do just whatever I like.
It's not fair!
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Warfare, the podcast by the War Law Institute. Today we are very happy to be joined by Azad Essa, who is a journalist at Middle East Eye, and he's also author of this fantastic book, Hostile Homelands, on the alliance between India and Israel. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Aisha.
So I wanted to start off by asking if you could explain to me the origins of this closeness, this now growing closeness between India and Israel, and how did this evolve into being a strategic partnership?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. So that's a large question. For that, we have to sort of go back to the founding of the State of Israel, 1948, the partition, of course, of the subcontinent, and the creation of India and Pakistan in 47. So that same period, you have India rejecting the partition plan of Palestine. And essentially what happens is that a few years later, India recognizes Israel, and you have this narrative that starts building that India is extremely pro-Palestine. And of course it does, as I say, it rejected the Palestine partition. And so it does project itself in this way that it's pro-Palestine. But through the 60s into the 70s, it starts, coordinating with the Israelis secretly on military ties, buying weapons for the war with China in 62, for the war against Pakistan in 65, in 1971 as well. And then you have RAW and Mossad beginning to cooperate with each other through the 70s. And I'm obviously giving you a very quick summary. In the 1980s, when the project in India starts moving towards liberalizing the economy, the story of, linking Israel to India joins the story of the new liberal project in India. So the journey towards getting closer to the US, to joining the global capitalist economy, the road goes through Israel, is what the Indians are told. And by 1992, when India normalizes ties, that relationship now is ready to sort of blossom in a way. So in the 90s, you have this, you have India purchasing weapons from Israel. But what India really enjoys about the relationship with Israel, and it only comes out later, is that the Israelis offer not just the sale of weapons, but also the exchange of the technology to the Indians. And that kind of goes into the Indian psyche that not only are we going to be able to build up our arsenal, but maybe we'll be able to import those methods, those actual weapons itself that we can build. Right, and they want to actually become self-sufficient. That has been the anxiety on the Indian side, right? Now, a major thing happens in 2001, which and 9/11 takes place, and the global war on terror, or so-called war on terror, starts, and that really brings these two countries together because now India is able to join the bandwagon of the global war on terror, and it then adopts that language and starts categorizing people in Kashmir who are pushing for self-determination as terrorists because they can add to that lexicon that's already built around the world. And the relationship really takes off properly during the 2000s. And India purchases about 1 billion per year, or you could say 10 billion within those 8 years or so, worth of military imports as such. And of course, that builds that scaffolding to 2014, when Narendra Modi comes in and says he wants to build this Hindu state, and he looks at Netanyahu as a kind of figure to emulate.
Yeah, and we had really vomit-inducing bromance headlines about the relationship between Netanyahu and Modi. I found it so interesting in your book, and it's even more interesting given that I'm aware of this alliance and how it's been, but the secret ties between RAW and Mossad throughout the wars with China and the wars that India fought with Pakistan. And I think the weapons transfer, the technology transfer is one thing, but the political philosophy kind of underlying Hindutvaism and Zionism. To what extent do you think it's so closely linked, especially Hindutvaism, in terms of Islamophobia? So what do you think about that ideological basis for both of them? Because they kind of see each other as kindred spirits. We're against the Muslims, and so are you, and that's how we can make this bond.
Yeah, 100%. To understand Hindutva and Zionism, one has to think about the fascist movements in Europe. And I think that's key, because once you understand the fascist movements in Europe, you kind of can tie it back to Hindutva and Zionism as these two ideologies that are inspired as well by the fascist movements in Europe. And what I mean by this is that Hindutva looked at the fascist movements. We're talking about Mussolini in the 30s, even Nazism, as well in Germany, as kind of, this ideology that was sort of reigniting or reinvigorating the society, right? And that reinvigoration of the society was predicated on treating a certain population a particular way, and this meant Jews essentially in Europe. And so Hindu nationalists looked at the situation in Europe and looked at Jews in Europe and looked back into India and said, these guys have a Jewish problem, we have a Muslim problem. And this may be, or this is the way to deal with this problem. And Zionists looked at the fascist treatment of Jews in Europe and took those same tactics into Palestine and then basically used that against the Palestinians. And the Hindu nationalists looked at how Zionists were using those methodologies against the Palestinians. And in a way, it's ironic, but not really, because it's about the fascist method. They then are attracted or kind of impressed by how Zionists use those methods on the Palestinians. And that kind of ties the relation between Hindutva and Zionism, because it's really very much the glue. Islamophobia is very much the glue that ties them together. And you have these two ideologies that are built on expansionism, right? You think about Eretz Israel, the idea of, this Israel that never ends, right? Based on biblical texts or on anyone's imagination. And then you have Akhand Bharat, which is, this idea of undivided India that expands from Afghanistan to Myanmar. And so there's this expansionist idea, and there's this exclusionary idea, which is the idea that, Israel is the home of the Jewish people exclusively. India is the homeland of Hindus exclusively. And everyone else are basically outsiders, foreigners. They are invaders, and they need to be disciplined. So Palestinians need to be disciplined. Muslims need to be disciplined. Even Christians need to be disciplined, unless they sort of become subservient to the nation. And to build, one level above that, we think about Palestinian citizens of Israel or Muslims in India today, as India sort of marches towards this Hindu state. They may be citizens, but by not being Hindu and by not being Jewish in Palestine or in Israel, they're not part of the nation.
Yeah.
And so there's a link between the religion and the nation, essentially. And so that's essentially the most sort of like easiest way to kind of summarize how these two ideologies are kind of linked.
Yeah, and I think it's super interesting as well to look at it in the context of the May 2025 conflict between India and Pakistan, given that India was using Israeli Harab drones to infiltrate Pakistan's territory and to surveil them. But also in the fact that now that India-Israeli nexus is really being talked about so much more, especially in the country that we're in, Pakistan. Pakistanis are talking about it more. But we haven't really had that narrative link between Palestine and Kashmir. And I think that the Pakistani state has really tried to drum it up, but we're not seeing that link being played out in the narrative. Why do you think that is? And also, to what extent do you think India and Israel are occupying powers, borrowing from other occupying powers in their treatment of the occupied populations?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And there are many reasons for why Kashmir and Palestine are not linked so easily or so straightforwardly, and part of that is to do with how India has branded itself, and this goes back all the way to the independence movement within India itself, or the subcontinent at the time, the British Raj, and this idea that India was pro-Palestine, and so when India becomes a state in 1947, it then becomes a leader of the non-aligned movement, and when it does so, the non-aligned movement kind of basically rejects Israel's membership of the group, and India as a leader is seen as de facto being the reason Israel is not part of that group.
Right.
But it's not actually the case. It's other countries, including Pakistan, that push back to ensure that Israel is not part of the non-aligned movement, for example, and we also have to understand the sort of like the soft power that India has had over these several decades in exactly projecting itself in this way. And so therefore the story of Kashmir is then linked to Pakistan to a large extent. It's not linked as it's not spoken of as a self-determination matter, right? And so we have a stage in which, when you talk about and Islamophobia is also related to that. When you think about Palestine, it's not seen by the global left as a Muslim issue, right? But Kashmir is seen as a Muslim issue because of the connection to Pakistan, and I think that creates a difficulty in sort of narrating that. And India is also able to make this a case of cross-border terrorism, and it's so easily categorizes it in that way that people aren't able to move past that.
Yeah, and the war on terror narrative has been one that has been so exploited by India and Israel. And I remember Benjamin Netanyahu, straight after 9/11, he said, this is going to be great for us. And it proved to be incredibly good for them in terms of how much that they can exploit the freedom fighters as being terrorists. And I think it's... You mentioned in your book a point that I think is so underexplored in the literature, which is caste Hinduism. And the fact that you have this kind of notion in the West that this is a kind of hippie religion, much like Buddhism, which wants good for everybody. And then you see the way that the Brahmin Hindus in the West completely ostracize Dalits, and the way that that caste is then promoted and emphasized, and also the way that Muslims are treated in light of that. And I just think that that's never talked about. And I think, again, that comes down to India's soft power, right? That they managed to pretend that they're this liberal secular state, but Kashmir is really a nail in the coffin for that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the issue of caste in the West is something that still lacks that proper examination, because you have a lot of Indians who moved to different parts of the West in different periods in the last 50 years, and you had a large chunk of people. For instance, we can talk about here the rise of Hindu nationalism in the UK or in the US, primarily by upper caste Hindus that moved in the 70s, for instance, and they become extremely wealthy by the early 90s. These are professionals in medicine or in academia or in tech. And they then are able to project themselves as a sort of like a marginalized minority in the West, while sort of enjoying all the privileges of being an upper caste Hindu. And then they also started, the story is like, there's so many layers to this, right? And one of them being that India, as it marches towards, the global capitalist economy, and it starts moving towards Israel as well, it wants to be close to the US. And the US in the 90s, you think about Hollywood and the kind of projections of Muslims, during that time, and then especially after 9/11 as well, there's a demonization of Muslims that take place, and Hindu nationalists, want to get closer to the U.S. narrative or to the U.S. To U.S. foreign policy, to become more connected to that. It kind of draws that Islamophobia, from that, right? And it kind of it builds on that, and as a result, you have these Hindu nationalists who then kind of look at Israel and think to themselves, how can we, be treated by the U.S. in the same way that the U.S. treats the Israelis? How can we align our interests with U.S. interests, essentially, or U.S. power? And that relationship is pretty much built on this caste, upper caste ideology, this Hindu nationalist ideology of expansion and exclusion.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly the role that Bollywood has played in the way that they depict Muslims. I mean, Dhurandhar just came out, but there have been countless other films, including the Kashmir Files, about what happened to the Kashmiri Pandits, which is just such a contested history when you listen to Kashmiri Muslims compared to them, and then Anupam Kher doing whatever the hell it is he does. Ironically, I think that for the Muslim male, I would much rather they be depicted as this hyper-masculine warrior type who is controlling the women in his life rather than, the emasculated Indian like Raj from Big Bang Theory who can't even talk to women. I actually think that perhaps the side effect of that is something better. But in terms of the getting to Washington through Israel, that is something that we've seen that Saudi has done too. So Bob Woodward reports about this, that Mohammed bin Salman, he spoke to Mohammed bin Zayed from the UAE, and he was very much his protege in the past, and not so much now as we're seeing that split, but that he said to him, look, the only way to Washington is through Tel Aviv. So you've got to get close to the Israelis, and then you can get close to the US. We're seeing MBS kind of step back a little bit from that in making ties. We've had the recent defense pact with Pakistan, and perhaps Turkey is going to be a part of that defense pact too. And as you lay out in your book too, you had this alliance between India providing labor, UAE providing capital, and Israel providing technology. So the ways in which those now regional dynamics are playing out is super interesting. And we just had a show of that with Modi going to the UAE and then them deciding on defense deals, on business deals. So how do you think that's going to play out regionally?
I think there's several things here to also think about. And one of them is that, in your original question about how India, moved from being, perceived as a particular player in the region as well as being pro-Palestine, and how it became a strategic partner. That road also, was paved by the Gulf countries. It was paved by the normalization agreements that took place. So you have Modi coming in 2014, and you have the normalization of, the UAE, and then forced upon Sudan and then Morocco, etc. That creates the impetus for Modi to accelerate in its ties, right? And so the UAE is fundamental to this entire dynamic between India and Israel.
All right.
And so you can see how this relationship with India and Israel develops as the UAE's relationship with Israel also kind of accelerates. So it's kind of like they're moving in tandem or even parallel to each other. And what's really interesting is over the past few years has been this emergence of this group called IMAC. Firstly it's the U2, I2, right? The UAE, US, India, Israel, sort of like grouping. Mm-hmm. And then you have IMEC, which is the India Middle East Economic Corridor. And that's also a case of like how these countries, as you said quite correctly, you have UAE capital, you have Israeli sort of tech, you have Indian labor, and you have the US protection, sort of like this new ecosystem that's being built. Mm. And now you're seeing a kind of response to that with the Saudis and the Turks and Pakistan as well. Basically, you have India now, and if we take it back to the key discussion here, which is about Palestine.
Yeah.
What we're seeing now is that you're seeing a relationship that's being built up that's pretty much trying to consolidate Israel's place in the Middle East. Right, and the U.S. as the protector of that relationship, right, and or that place in the Middle East, and India being kind of subservient to it, as well as also a supporter of that. So, meaning that India was involved in the genocide in Gaza. Mm-hmm. It's also going to send labor to replace Palestinians in Gaza as well as in the West Bank as well. Okay. So they're kind of building an ecosystem to kind of keep these nations all keep the status quo essentially in place, basically.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how that may be balanced in the future with Pakistan, Turkey, and Saudi forming their own alliance. I also wanted to touch upon the issue of which I think that we face in the global South, but especially in these two countries, of useful idiots. And so you have Sheikh Abdullah basically handing over self-determination on a plate to the Indians in exchange for becoming chief minister. And you have the same thing in the sense of the Palestinian Authority, which has had plummeting approval ratings, and yet we're probably going to see them lead some kind of Gaza Authority in the future. And so what do you think the role has been in these useful idiots in Kashmir and Palestine with the state that they're supposed to be, which is supposed to be their occupying state that they're supposed to be trying to claim statehood from?
Yeah, I mean, these are the creations of of colonizers, right? So the Indian state, even prior to sort of copying Israeli tactics in Kashmir, have propped up these sort of leaders to ensure that their control over the population is basically outsourced to these guys, right? To these contractors. And so both Palestinian Authority and obviously the Kashmiri government, right, which is not really, they're not anything anymore because they're not even a state, right? They have basically, done the work for India. And so this like sort of puppet regimes has essentially tried their best to kind of suppress and to suffocate the Palestinian move to self-determination. And and Kashmiri desire for self-determination. And what's really interesting in the Palestinian case is that you have, at this point in time, you have like this parallel, narrative or parallel realities like playing out. And what I mean by this is that the Indians are trying their best to show how they are so tied and so in awe of the Israelis. And the Palestinian Authority is kind of at times trying to showcase that, they still have so much of affection for the Indians because they don't want to lose that sort of tie in with the Indians who are giving them sort of like the scraps. Because that's what it is, essentially. Indians are passing on donations. They give 5 students a scholarship to come to India. They'll give you $1 million to develop like, a school in Ramallah.
Okay.
Right? And meantime, they're purchasing weapons worth $1 billion, sending drones to Gaza, using Israeli drones in Kashmir, using drones on the farmers, in Haryana. And so you have this weird thing where they are in many ways kind of undermining Palestinians and the Kashmiri government as well is also undermining Kashmiris willingly.
And now 2 years after October 7th, we've seen a genocide which has been live streamed to all of our phones, and we've seen now this Gaza peace plan, which many believe is not going to pave the way for Palestinian statehood in the slightest. And we've seen a Kashmir issue which has been largely neglected. Article 370 happened in 2019. It's been 6 years from then. And we have a new normal in Kashmir now. So in terms of these movements for self-determination, what do you see for that going forward in 2026?
I think we're just going to see the situation get worse in many ways. The genocide hasn't ended. It's continuing. There's no coverage of it any longer. In Kashmir, the story is pretty much buried as well, unless there is some type of, issue that comes up there. Recently, I was talking to someone else, and one of the things that just occurred to me is that in many ways, even though Israel is bombing Gaza, right, the similarity between Israel and India when it comes to Kashmir and Palestine is not Gaza. Gaza is like this extreme absurdity that we've witnessed, but it's very much similar to the West Bank, right? And so what's happening in the West Bank, in terms of like the ethnic cleansing that's taking place, the continuous displacement of people, and these kind of like sporadic murders that happen, every day, right, including of children. Those kinds of things are happening in Kashmir, but in terms of the surveillance in Kashmir, it's probably worse. Right? It's probably worse than what's happening in the West Bank because, Israel, somehow still allows, and it's partly to do with their marketing, a marketing exercise for their weapons, right? To showcase what they can do to people and to showcase their impunity. But the Indian approach is not to sort of boastfully, showcase what they are doing in Kashmir. It's kind of everything's under the cover because they don't have that kind of international approval to be doing these things. So if you're a journalist in Kashmir or you're an activist in Kashmir, you basically you're not able to do anything at this point. Even VPNs now are banned in Kashmir. So even in Gaza, you could use an eSIM, right? And this is no way a comparison, right? But just to show you kind of like how absurd these whole situations are. At Gaza, you had people using eSIMs from Egypt or somewhere else, right? If you use the eSIM in Kashmir, you are immediately sort of identified as someone who may be an armed fighter or an hostile actor, they will come and find you immediately and take you away. So this is the kind of surveillance that we're talking about.
Yeah, and it's so interesting even seeing the Indian media during the May 2025 battle, but also seeing the statements from Zionists. The right wing has really taken a hold in both of these countries, but the extent to which the narrative plays out within the country compared to the statements that they give abroad is quite horrifying to see. In terms of what that means for the minorities within that country, especially when it came to the Knesset, and that it's often said that, oh no, but we have Arabs in the Knesset, just like the way they give Kashmiri some rights within India. And then you had, I think it was Ben-Gvir's Smotrich saying to them that you're only here because we didn't finish the job, right? Like you're here because that was our failure. We didn't do enough to get rid of you. And the way in which that is still going to be a state which is embraced by the West as being a liberal, democratic, secular one, rather than, authoritarian regimes, which they love to decry when it suits them the best.
No, this label of democracy is essentially what is helping these two countries also sort of continue with their policies, because the moment you cease to be a democracy, right, and you endorse not being a democracy, then you are clubbed with a different set of nations, right? Suddenly you are North Korea, you are Cuba, maybe even Iran, right? So immediately you are something else. But if you're able to present yourself with some kind of semblance of a democratic culture, right? Even if it's not real. Israel is not a democracy. In many ways, India is not a democracy either, right? But to claim, we are the world's largest democracy, it gives you the impression that these are countries. What is democracy? Democracy is not about people voting, but it's the idea that you can hold your governments accountable. Right, and so if you there'll be transparency, there'll be institutions like the media, there'll be institutions like the judiciary. Those things you just mentioned, right? The media is not a serious. The mainstream media, at least in India, is not a serious institution. It's completely captured.
They're foaming at the mouth.
At the mouth. The judiciary, right? When you look at the judgments when it comes to Article 370, even the Supreme Court, it kind of endorsed it, right? Look at how they ruled when it came to the Babri Masjid as well. How they ruled with Umar Khalid and Shajil Imam as well. The judiciary is not serious either, right? So these are not democracies in that way. But someone has to decide that it's not a democracy anymore. Right. But the problem is that is lying with the West in many ways, that endorsement, right? And so, maybe that's inaccurate, but the idea that these countries are still regarded as democracies means that they are able to get away with it, because then they can say, we're going to do an investigation, right? And so therefore we can trust that investigation. But
Thank you so much for joining us. This was such an interesting conversation. And thank you to everyone watching at home. We hope you'll tune in for future episodes.